Okay, so just a little bit of framing. So we've moved through this is the last week where we're going to talk about things in sort of like long historical way. And now we're going to start moving into either specific issues or specific theories of race that are more contemporary. And this kind of is a transitional period, like I kind of designed this to be a little transitional because we're talking about nationalism, right? But I chose something that's extremely contemporary, which is to look at the rise of the far right movements in Europe. And we could claim the same thing happening in the United States as well. So we're going to look at nationalism within context, but first, we're still catching up on our columns, and I want to make sure that we get those early chapters down. If you're feeling like we're getting behind, don't worry, we'll catch back up, because the thing about reading a book is sometimes they'll get a little repetitive, so there'll be some chapters we just kind of breeze through later on. So that's what we're going to start with today. How are people's literature reviews going? Are people started on that? Make sure if you have not started on it, you really should, because you may have to order things from the library. So make sure that you can get it in time to actually look it over and stuff before you add it to your list. So make sure that it's going to work for you. So and that usually takes like 3-ish days. So we're looking at Friday as a deadline. So like if you haven't gotten to it yet, you may want to start working on your lit review today or tomorrow. So okay, any questions? Thoughts people have? No? Okay, cool. And I'm going to write our take home. I'll send you guys an email. I'm hoping to get to it today and post your guys' take home today, and then we'll actually talk about it on Thursday, but that'll give you time to work on it if you want to work on that as well. So in the past, I've never assigned something before the assignment before it was due. But this semester, because it's such a forced march, you literally just can't do that. So like, especially like I like to give a couple weeks or at least a week and a half to work on things. And you can't actually like line it up right. So if people have noticed a difference of overlapping assignments who've had me before, like that's why, is because like this semester it's just like bam, straight through. I mean, we're already a third of the way through the semester. Are people aware of that? Like totally like, yeah, we are a third of the way through this already, so it's a very different beast this semester. So, okay, we left off talking about Collins. We're in chapter 3. So we had just talked about. Well, I'll have you guys reiterate. So what have we talked about from this chapter so far? In particular, where I'm getting a history down. Did you have something? It looks like you did.
We've been talking about like how the black woman's experience has been very different from white women's experiences, and how they're treated differently as women. They're more like they work more instead of like fighting to work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the intersectionality is the term. Yeah, that's been the overarching theme of our book so far. This problem of intersectionality, that you have to understand forms of difference, right, is related to each other within, and that's the phrase, the matrix of domination, right? That there's multiple ways. Everybody's dominated somehow. Some of us are dominated in multiple and different ways. So yeah, taking that position. So in this chapter, the chapter that we're in the middle of, we've been looking at specifically a different reading of history from the standpoint of black women in America, right? And so what have we talked about so far in terms of this history? We're pretty early in the history, so what's happened? I'll give you guys a page number. We're picking up on page 57, so that's as far as we got.
Kind of going back, like, was with slavery, and they emphasized like how they dealt with children and motherhood and like reproduction and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so we're looking at particularly like the history of slavery and how the history of slavery helps us to understand the experience not only of black women but of African American families in the present. So that's what we're moving towards, right? So she provides this sort of like, to some degree, reinterpretation of history. So what were families like before slavery, where slaves came from? Make sure we have this down. Another way we could put it is, how did those families differ from our own experience of families? How were families in the past different?
There were lots of generations that lived together.
Yeah, there's multiple generations that live together. People existed in extended families, right? In the terms of African cultures, according to Collins, these were mainly drawn upon like what was referred to in here as bloodlines, what anthropologists today would call lines of descent, right? So you have these large families that live together as a family unit. We're sometimes literally talking about hundreds of people, right? So like, that's how you would understand kinship, that's how you would understand families, these sort of large extended things. How does that change during slavery, and how does it remain the same?
Black families started to like live with just their like mother, daughter, or mother, father, and like kids. But then the black families were being pulled apart, and so they didn't really have a specific like blood family. They kind of just were a family with all of the people they worked with, and then the black women tended to raise the white women's kids.
Yeah, yeah. So all that is exactly what Colin talks about. So basically we get this divergent, white families become more focused on the nuclear family unit over time, where African American families during slavery ended up being more, to some degree, broadened, more extended, right, into this sort of like communalism. So there's a tension there. Okay, so that's where we left off. On page 57, and I know you guys probably read this a while ago, did anybody catch this thing about black women and motherhood under slavery? System of slavery valued motherhood in a somewhat different way. So in what ways could we talk about slavery not valuing motherhood?
It's kind of like the owners, they wanted like black women, like they did want them to have kids, but they wanted to have kids so that way it could increase their labor and also their capital and their revenue and like their plantation, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, so black motherhood is encouraged under slavery, but it's as a sort of like means of making more profit, right? Like if you have a lot of, if your slaves have a lot of children, what do you have?
A lot more slaves.
A lot more slaves. Slaves that you can sell, slaves that you can use, right? So there's a weird system of motherhood here, right? So how do they reinforce this in slavery? What sort of things do they do for, what's different for mothers as opposed to women who don't have children in slavery?
They will like anchor them to like a specific place for longer.
Yeah, yeah. So one thing about being a slave is what are you usually forced to do? In other words, yeah, obviously you're forced to do a lot of things, but like in terms of where you live, what's forced upon you often?
Moving from like plantation to plantation or place to place.
Yeah, yeah. So your lives is one of constant movement as you're bought and sold as property, right? So like like you don't stay in just one place. And a lot of that is like the plantation system was very complex, right? How people were being used had to do with what, like, essentially, like, at what phase of life, what kind of labor were you good for, right? And they were being sold off. You think about it as the same thing as like essentially it's like treating people like a horse, right? Like if you buy a horse that's young, you use it differently than an elderly horse, right? They might also all have their purposes, they have different values, and they're treated like that. So essentially that's exactly how slaves are treated. So you have throughout your life being moved from one location to another. Now if you're a mother, it allows you to anchor in one place longer, which is more comfortable, right? Like moving every 6 months from plantation to plantation might not be super pleasant, right? Anchoring yourself in one place for the length of the child rearing is an advantage. What else do they do for mothers to encourage motherhood among slaves? I mean, the dark side of that is sometimes they do forced breedings, but
I think they said they were kind of like went easier on them, like they had less like workload and
yeah, they get lighter workload, they get better food, and they don't get beat as much, right? So this is a sort of so like here we have a system, extended family, fertility, birth rates, children being reinforced as a value, and this actually trickles down to the slaves themselves, right, who value motherhood in a very similar way. So, which in some ways lines up with sort of like the indigenous cultures from where they come from, and in some ways it doesn't, right? So once again, we're getting this sort of like transformation by the context, right? Okay, so that's the history of families during slavery. So picking up on page 58, we get this shift, and we're moving towards, contemporary sort of things. So how does emancipation change Black experiences of work and family? Because that's really, this chapter is work and family. How does it change it? Did anybody catch this? We're on page 58 and 59. I'm going to ask a strange question. How does being a slave differ from working for money? How do you get work when you work for money? It should be an obvious question. What do you have to do? What's that?
You like apply for the job that you want, I guess?
Yeah. When you work for money, you apply for a job. How many people do they interview for a job? How many people do you think apply for a given job? I know it'll depend on the job. Anywhere from a handful to hundreds, right? So essentially, a way to think of it is, as a person who works for a living, right? Like you are in competition with other people to get the resources of work, money, etc., right? If you haven't figured this out, you will, right? Like you're constantly in competition with other people in a wage economy. Just how it works, right? How is that different from being a slave? Do you think?
You don't really apply for a job, they just tell you what to do and you have to do it, else you're going to get punishment.
So how much of an incentive do you think it is for slaves to outperform other slaves? Or to undercut other slaves to try to get jobs? Not very, right? So like thinking about the communalism that came over from Africa, like in some ways the slave system in a weird contradictory way supported that continuing attitude. After emancipation, you get sort of different pressures being placed on the Black community. On one hand, you get sort of like an erosion of this communal structure, right? As Black people become increasingly in competition with one another, as in competition with white wage earners, particularly poor white wage earners. So that's one thing that happens. in what ways could we see a continuation, according to Collins? Did anybody catch this? Of the communal system. What do you think the result of putting black former slaves in competition with poor whites for wages? What do you think the outcome of that was historically? How do you think most whites in competition with blacks felt about having to compete with them?
More happy.
You think most whites felt more happy that they had to compete with?
No, they weren't happy.
They weren't happy. What do you think that resulted in? This is where we get the birth of sort of the systems of wide-scale violence against African Americans growing out of, right? This is the birth of things like the Ku Klux Klan, right? The lynchings, right? All this sort of stuff is built into this period, right? So once African Americans are emancipated, there's actually a really strong reaction against them. Partially because when they're originally emancipated, what do they also gain the right to do? Anyone familiar with this history? Something that women won't get the right to do till the 20th century. Vote. Black men have the right to vote. Initially, we even have things like black senators in the 1800s. We won't have that again for a very long time, right? And this is a part of like this post-Civil War politics. So after the Civil War, after African Americans are emancipated, does anybody know who took power in terms of the federal government? This is like that whole era of no one's familiar with this? Reconstruction in the South. There's these people called radical Republicans. And the radical Republicans took power. You have to keep in mind Republicans and Democrats flip. So what we think of as policies for the Republicans are usually actually the policies of the Democrats back then, vice versa. It flips in the 1960s over the issue of race. So the Republicans from the North, right, essentially managed to use the voting rights of African Americans to seize control of the Senate, right? This results in a sort of series of somewhat like terrorist violence on the part of whites in the South towards African Americans for a long time, until they basically disenfranchised them of their ability to vote and thus take power again. And that's the rise of the Democratic Party in the South. Anybody familiar with that history before? So that's essentially what happened. So a lot of the things that we sort of associate with white violence against blacks in that era, right, this is when it comes into being, is after the Civil War, right? So the violence of slavery is replaced by despite the fact of making wages, this sort of like the sharecropping system where essentially like often African Americans are still tied to specific land, and it's also paired with a different form of violence, in this case like often violence around competition. And as we'll look at later, fear of sexuality. Okay, so that's what's happening in this sort of transitional period. So we get this undercurrent of sort of like the destruction of the collectivism of African Americans, as well as it being reinforced, and it's really reinforced in a weird way by this violence, right? Because African Americans are always under the threat of being murdered. And I mean they are, right? Or being murdered, or being arrested for things that they didn't commit, specifically rape charges. There is, or being lynched, or et cetera, et cetera. There is a sort of like continued communalism that fights against that to make sure that African Americans stay safe, right? So this is I think this is a good like summary history of race in America, right? Like, and so like this is sort of an interesting, like it's a reinterpretation of it, but here we're getting sort of like very much so the different steps, right? So, okay. That's the initial transition to free labor. Let's leap forward to page 62. So throughout this period, African Americans are predominantly still living in rural areas, and they're living mostly in the South. Does anybody aware of what slowly happens, where African Americans slowly migrate to? Is that what it looks like today? Do most of African Americans live in the rural South today? So where do they go?
More urban areas?
Yeah. So, and anyone want to guess why African Americans moved to urban areas?
Factory work?
Yeah. So we have a massive, during this period we're also having a massive expansion of the industrial sector, right? So you get people moving into urbanizing areas, right? And this is also a continuation of this is also the history of like large African American populations in places like California, stuff like that. It's this urbanization, people getting work at factories. So this is the next transition, right? And the history of labor in families. So, today we catch, and so this is on page 62, what kind of work, so the type of work that people do is split by gender for African Americans. What kind of work do African American men get?
Hard thing, but like it wasn't as stable as like white or black women were.
Yeah, so both are working still, right? Throughout this history, both work. But the difference is so where in the past, right, in this sort of period of Reconstruction, black women and black men largely do the same work, farmhand work, right? When it urbanizes, black men do more profitable activities that are less stable, right? Another way to put it, what jobs at a factory do you think black men generally did when they initially urbanized in the late 1800s and early 20th century? So, because not all factory jobs are created equal, right? Like, you could have factory jobs at a factory that is stable and safe and you work year round. Anybody here ever work in a factory? So a lot of factories are actually just seasonal, depending on like what like things like agricultural production and stuff like that too, right? So like you have seasonal jobs often being done by African Americans, consistent work being done by whites, right? You have day labor jobs, so like you call in sick at a factory, do they just have an empty spot on the line? What do you think? No, they have to hire somebody for that. Those are day laborers, right? If you were to go down to a factory, back in the heyday of American industrialization, there would just be crowds of people standing outside the factory waiting to work, So people are taking other people's shifts, right? And so like that's mostly the work that African Americans do. They're sort of like, if you think of them, they're like factory substitute teachers, right? Like they come and they fill the position while no one's there. That's the kind of work that's being done mostly. It pays well, because what happens if you fill somebody's shift? How much wages do you get? Whatever that person gets paid. So when African Americans can work, they make as much as white laborers, but they probably only work once a week. Otherwise, they just stand outside and wait. So how does that differ from black women's work?
Didn't they say they got lower wages, but they had more of like a secure job? Or like they knew that they were gonna still have that job, but it just wasn't as high paid.
Yeah, so they worked jobs more consistently. So they're the stable income, and men are sort of like, in some ways, the income that really like substitutes the lack of wages that women have. How does that differ from the gender division of labor of whites in the late 1800s and early 20th century? Guesswork is fine, guys.
For whites, the man's income was usually a stable one. If anyone was like looking around for a job, it was probably a woman.
Yeah. So, and were women paid in those jobs as well as men? When women did little extra things for money? No. So what do you think, how do you think that differs in the power dynamics between men and women in this time in the African American community? How does that probably differ from men and women in the white community? If you were to just guess. What's the power dynamic between couples likely to be in the African American community versus the white?
Like the power's more equal.
Yeah, and we're going to get into the significance of that because that's often something that is often treated as a negative image of black femininity. When we get into the images here soon. Okay, so that's essentially gets us up to the period where, and also where, this is just needs to be said, where do African American, there's one other thing that happens in this period that's really significant, which is segregation. Are people familiar with what segregation is and how segregation laws work? I see some nods. Somebody want to just tell me? Tell the class just so we're all on the same page? I'm looking at you guys because you both nodded and haven't
It's
talked.
the whole 7 to 30 people. We're going to have the different groups, and we're going to keep them apart, but we're going to say that they're equal.
Yeah, so essentially like that whole period is where we separate out African Americans in a whole variety of ways from the Caucasian population. It's a result of a law called Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson will later get repealed, right? But essentially like there is, we all know this from growing up and learning about the civil rights movement, right? So like there are different restaurants, different bathrooms, different water fountains, different schools, different neighborhoods. What happens if an African American breaks this divide? They're incarcerated, right? So like that's kind of like, and this is forced separation between blacks and whites and created a lot of inequality, right? This is actually a very common thing in places that used to be colonies. Essentially we had the exact same policy as what in South Africa was called apartheid, right? Often whites essentially lobby to get African Americans separated from them, largely so they don't have to compete with them. So if you want to think about like the violence and fear and anger of what happened during Reconstruction and African Americans being able to vote and African Americans being in competition with poor whites, it's largely through groups like the Ku Klux Klan and other similar groups that enacted violence upon African Americans who also put enough pressure on things, right, to create something like segregation. Very similar history to what we get in a lot of particularly settler colonies. So, that's in essence how we did it in the United States. Okay. There's last, and this is like a great quick cursory history of American racial history, right? So civil rights movement happens. And this is, so we start on page 65 and move over to page 66. Civil rights movement happens, segregation is repealed, right? Discrimination laws are put into, anti-discrimination laws are put into place. How does this change life for African Americans? According to, this is particularly on page 66, according to Collins. And this is how most scholars are going to interpret the outcome of the civil rights, which isn't quite as positive as a lot of our sort of like high school level history textbooks and stuff will have us think. How does civil rights help change lives for African Americans? It depends. Right? Does everyone benefit equally from the civil rights movement? Who benefits from the civil rights movement?
Black males.
Black males benefit more. Who else benefits more? Middle class African Americans. So in a lot of ways what the civil rights movement ended up doing is it ended up in a lot of ways splitting the African American community in half. And so what you have then is what's often referred to in the literature is you get the creation, you get the upward mobility of middle class African Americans, right? And then you have the creation of the permanent underclass. Permanent underclass, which suffers mostly just from intergenerational poverty. So this is in essence what happens as a result of the civil rights movement. That different parts of the African American population are capable of benefiting from it differently. So what happens to middle class African Americans in this period? And then this gets back to like important things to understand. This is why intersectionality becomes such a big thing after Collins writes this book, right? There isn't any unified black population that we can talk about, right? Instead, African Americans themselves represent a variety of communities, right? And a variety of forms of difference, right? And this is one example of that, right? So what happens to middle class African Americans during this period? Do they remain as heavily segregated? No. They integrate more and more so into particularly urban white culture, right? So like now very often you will work with African Americans. You will, live in the same neighborhoods as African Americans, right? But for the permanent underclass, they remained just as segregated, sometimes arguably more segregated than they did under segregation. So like underclass African Americans, do they attend the same schools as white kids? No. Do they live in the same neighborhoods as white kids? No. Right? Do they work at the same jobs as white people? No. And the unemployment rate is extremely high amongst the urban underclass, right? So this sort of intergenerational poverty in a lot of ways, and so like really what happens to the underclass is they get relegated to the ghetto. And this is also in a more current context, with a lot of the stuff about the criminal justice system, it's the permanent underclass that primarily is imprisoned in mass incarceration. This is a contemporary figure. We read this were you in Critical Crim or just Theories of Crime? Theories. In Critical Crim, we read a book by somebody named Luc Wacquant, and Luc Wacquant, who's French-Canadian. But he was writing about basically like the prison being the extension of the ghetto, which in a lot of ways you can draw a line from slavery to the prison, and it's actually the continuing of this sort of separation of population, right? So this happens. There's one other thing that happens, and this has a major influence on particularly the underclass African American communities, which is something called deindustrialization. Has anyone ever heard of deindustrialization before? How many of you in this room's parents are factory workers? Do you think if I asked this question in the 1970s, I would get the same answer? Why? Anyone here, if you go back a couple generations, are factory workers? I see some nods. How many people, a couple generations back, are factory workers? At least a third of us, right? What happens to the factory jobs?
over?
Some of it's technology. What else happens? Where are things made?
The Rust Belt, they can,
Well,
Overseas.
overseas, yeah. Pretty much everything gets made overseas. Things got outsourced. That's actually why it's called the Rust Belt. The Rust Belt was like all the factories. Now it's the deindustrialized zone of the United States. Right? So the places that used to be primarily factory work, right, became deindustrialized. How did this affect African Americans? There's two ways this affected African Americans. We could start with this. How did this affect the working class? What happened to the working class in America?
They lost their jobs.
They lost their jobs. And they did one of two things. They either became middle class or they became lower class, working poor. Right? So it was primarily, most people who were factory workers ended up as working poor. So we had the death of the working class. Just like right now, there's a lot of talk about this, the death of the middle class. So what you get, right, during deindustrialization is the sort of like death of those jobs. How do you think that would have affected African Americans? What's one way that probably affected African Americans? How much training did you have to work in a factory?
Not much.
None, yeah. My father-in-law never got past the 9th grade in high school, and he worked as a millwright in GM, that's skilled labor. He probably earned about $90,000 a year as a millwright, right? In the 90s, right? So like, you think about that, right? Like, what kind of opportunities did most African Americans take advantage of during the 60s and 70s? Mostly factory work, right? So like, probably the steadiest form of income for non-educated African Americans was factory work, right? So essentially in this even more heightened competition, right, largely for the people who were capable of escaping the working class and going into the middle class, those people were predominantly white. And a lot of that has to do with latent forms of capital. The language that white working class people speak is more close to the white middle class, right? There's informal forms of capital, or if you don't know that term, I'm sure we'll come across that again. But like, there's informal ways in which our system like recognizes the cultural power of whites, so whites were capable of escaping into, right, the middle class at a higher rate. Most still ended up working poor, but even more so amongst African Americans. So that's one way that it affected it. Two, where are the factories? In terms of urban and rural locations, where were most factories?
Urban areas.
They were in urban areas. Where did the people who worked in them live?
Pretty close to the factory.
Yeah, most of them lived in urban areas. So you get, right, even more so, sort of like flight out of urban areas in this period, particularly in the 1980s, right? So you get people moving out of the Rust Belt, right, and then moving out into the suburbs or out into the country, because they're no longer tied to those factory jobs, right? At the same time that you get middle-class African Americans moving out, right? This creates this sort of feeling, right? And this is when a lot of American cities just got gutted. They became a belt of suburb, and then everything on the inside was abandoned buildings and stuff like that. Like, that's not really true anymore. We have this re-urbanization. Collins doesn't go that far because this book was written 20 years ago. But, so when this book was written, which is when I grew up, like, you generally didn't go to a downtown area because mostly it was gutted, right? So this happened in most American cities. Where do most African Americans in the United States continue to live? In the cities, right? So that's a big part of what, like, to understand. So this is the long view, right? So how does this change the relationship between men and women in terms of, or how does this tie in with the family stuff? What do you think?
They became more reliant on like black women, like wages.
Yeah, people became more reliant on black women's wages that reinforced this sort of matriarchal thing, right? Families also became increasingly impoverished and more unstable, but you also still had a lot of communitarianism. But this gets undercutted to some degree by the movement of people, right? So that's kind of where we're leaving off in terms of this history of labor. Make sense? Yeah.
I just had a quick question. I know
Yeah,
that
totally.
a lot of like black fathers were taken out by like various parties like war on drugs laws and stuff like that. But
Yep.
did that also have any like does a single motherhood have anything to do with women being able to work? Because I know we talk about like there's less marriage among like anybody when when women are able to work, because they have that economic freedom, but it sounds like black women already had that.
Yeah.
So did it start earlier for them because of that? Did that play any role, do you think?
Yeah, I think that, yeah, that is part of the history. Like, women are less dependent upon males, so it starts earlier, right? And then, so pulling the threads together, right? We have a belief in an extended focus on an extended relationships within the community as opposed to nuclear families. So that in some ways, like, there's less value surrounding nuclear family in African American communities. For white people, they look at that, and it looks like, and essentially that gets coded as something amoral, right? But that's only because we're looking at it through the value of, right, white people's families. That's kind of her major, if you think where she started, right? That was the major point she started with. But if you think about like the long history of slavery, the long history of women's work, et cetera, what you see is you see that they have a very different idea of family structure, which to some degree we could extend all the way back to their origins and roots, right? Pre-slavery, clean to what happens today. Now this isn't equally true for all African Americans. It's very different for the African American middle class, where you often get them mirroring white culture, right? But for underclass African Americans who also like to mirror white culture, it would be very difficult for them, especially when you think about things like the incarceration rates of white males, right? Things like that lead to much higher, like, broken up families. Also, like, you know, gender norms in general between men and women, things like that, right? You get very much so a different family structure. We have a tendency, though, to, in our demonization of them, to demonization of this sort of like family stuff, we also have a tendency to disregard the plight of African Americans. Often it gets laid at the door of not having nuclear families. Right? This becomes often an explanation rather than, so like, in some ways, like how do we understand the relationship between poverty and the structure of nuclear families? Collins wants to claim, or structure of families for African Americans, Collins wants to claim that we have to flip that relationship, right? If you want to understand African American families, you have to understand it as embedded with a long struggle of having their labor either not paid, undervalued, right, et cetera, right? So that's kind of the tension here. Good question. Other questions on this chapter? Thoughts people want to share? Once again, I didn't write the book, so view me as a parrot. You can say whatever you want about it. Like, I'm not gonna like be like, how dare you? You can have any kind of dialogue you guys want. How familiar is this history for you guys? Was this pretty novel for you guys then? It's kind of our first interaction with the history of America in race in this class. Could people see how it's sort of a reinterpretation from the normal sort of race narrative we hear? Right, okay, cool. Well, if there's no more questions, we'll move on to the next chapter. We'll move, like I said, we'll probably move through future chapters a little less slowly, but right now we're getting, I think, a lot of good groundwork. So there's a shift, right? So she's looking at different ways in which we can understand the oppression of African Americans. So this first one, right, was about work. This one is instead more about culture. So this one's about the images we have of African American women. Another, what we'd colloquially commonly call stereotypes, right? So these are the sort of like the stereotypes that we use to interpret the actions of African American women. And so like she goes through several of these and how they end up reinforcing the situation of African American women. So, everyone follow me first of all? One thing I just wanna make sure we know a definition. It's an important definition. Objectification. Do people know what objectification is? This gets used in different ways, and Collins is meaning it in more than one at once, so it's worth pausing for. What does it mean to objectify something? Just guess from the word. If you objectify it.
To look at something as an object.
Yeah, it's to not look at something as an object, to turn something into an object. So initially, this language grows out of Marxism, and then it becomes an important part of feminism. So in Marxism, they'll often talk about objectification of labor. So, one of the basic sort of, how much have you guys learned about Marxism in your classes? I'm just going to pause there for a second. You know this isn't a scare word in sociology, right? Like Marxism is like one of the major theoretical frameworks for sociologists. It's not revolutionary Marxism. So I think we have a tendency to leap to like, I don't know, Lenin and Trotsky and people dressed in drab green, like overthrowing governments, right? Like, that's not the branch of Marxism that sociology grows out of. It's more like these theoretical things of like, how do we understand work? How do we understand the economy, right? And already we've kind of seen her starting point. Collins is influenced by Marxism, right? That's why she starts with labor. We just got a history of labor, right? So in Marxism, they often talk about the objectification of labor. What that means is like work changes in modernity. Before, work often was an expression of yourself, right? You had a lot of control over what you did. And so like when you worked, you created something, right? You tilled the earth and you made made vegetables or grain or whatever, and you went and sold that on the market, right? Or like you were some sort of craftsman who, I don't know, like weaves linen, or I always think of that. Did anybody have to read Silas Marner in high school? The guy's a linen weaver. But anyways, I just thought that sounded like a weird job. But anyways, he would just make like table linens. That was his job, right? But in the end, like he has control over his own work. He makes his own table linens. He sells them, right? This is how most people work. Are people familiar with this, or is this all kind of new? Okay, so in the 19th century in particular, we get this transition away from this model of work to, rather than people selling objects, what do we sell? What do you sell when you work? Anybody here work? What kind of jobs do people have?
Retail,
Retail. What do you sell in retail?
clothing.
Do you sell clothing? Do they pay you for clothing?
They pay me to hold their clothes and find them the right sizes.
So what are they paying you for?
Following around rich women and making sure that they're happy. Sing it.
Yeah, you don't sell an object, right?
No.
What do you sell?
Your time.
You sell your time? What else do you sell? Because it's not just time, like nobody pays you to just like sit in a room and look at a clock. It's your time and your effort, right? You sell your labor and your time, right? This is what Marxism refers to as the objectification of human labor. So essentially our work, our ability to work gets transformed into a commodity. It gets transformed into something you would sell, like you could sell clothes, like you could sell whatever, right? So it becomes an object for sale. In essence, like anytime we see this word objectification, you have something that at one time was not an object, and then it becomes one, right? Sometimes this process is also referred to as commodification. Things that are not objects become them. Where before, anybody here take philosophy classes, subject, object, right? The subject is you, right? The actor, the being, the person, right? So at one time, labor would have been something, an expression of your human subject, right? Now it's often become an object that you sell. And this is true of everybody. This is true of CEOs, this is true of people who work at McDonald's, right? If you're selling something, most of the time you are just selling, in some ways, a piece of yourself that you've objectified, turned into an object, right? So that's one way that this often gets used, right? How does it get used in feminist literature? What's the thing that's being rendered into an object? Because it's not necessarily that you're selling it. I mean, you could. In feminist, has you ever heard this term used? This is actually, I think, the way that seeps into our culture more, feminists talking about the objectification of women. What does that mean?
Seeing them as an object for pleasure or childbirth or whatever, those words, things like that.
Yeah. So women, rather than being a human subject, get sort of like rendered into their bodies. They become objects, right? We objectify women. And you hear that a lot surrounding things like advertisements, right? You watch advertisements and they use women's bodies to sell everything from like beer to cars, right? Like, and all of it is an objectification. So that's kind of the idea of that. So primarily in feminist literature, and as well as in Marxism, a lot of this objectification comes from images within our culture, right? So people get rendered into objects, and the objectification of women's bodies to sell things doesn't just have the ramification of like, oh, it's a bad use on TV. It has the ramifications of it, supports a culture of sexual assault, a culture of rape, a culture of mistreating women in various ways, right? So there you get kind of the same idea, right? So the idea is that there's an image of people that gets promoted that renders them into some form of object, which allows you to treat them a certain way, right? This is very similar to what we talked about when we talked about things like otherizing earlier this semester, right? You render somebody into an other, you can treat them differently, right? This is the same sort of idea, right? That you render women. So what are the images that's used for black women, right? Is another way of rephrasing our question. That clock's actually right. Most of my classes, it seems like the clock's wrong, and I have to like get my phone out, and this one it's actually right. So. Okay, cool. So I think we can take a few of these. So starting on page 79. Did anybody catch any of these images on their own? The various images she runs through in this chapter? No? So the first image that she talks about for our culture is the image of the mammy. This is something we see that women get treated as. So our first image is the mammy. Anybody catch what this is an image of? It's the one that she probably spent the longest amount of time on.
It's like someone who's like really nurturing and they like really like their job. Yeah, I know. Like,
Yeah.
To cook, like.
Yeah, so is anybody familiar with what a mammy is? We're not, so I think most of us aren't from down south, especially if we are, we're not from like rich down south. Has anybody ever heard this term before? Yeah.
Wouldn't they take care of like the white people's kids and like cook and clean?
Yeah. So essentially a mammy is a domestic servant that cooks, cleans, takes care of the white family in general, raises the kids, etc., etc. I still see this every once in a while pop up in a real direct way in culture. Anybody watch this show Sharp Objects on HBO? It was a show a few years ago. It definitely had some character that was like portrayed specifically as a mammy. Traditionally, this is the image is that she's kind of calling out, and if you watch older movies, you see this is like one of the major portrayals of African American women in older stuff. It's kind of like usually an older, overweight, desexualized black woman, right? Who everybody loves, who's sweet to everybody likes her, and she's perfectly happy to be sort of serving. In a lot of ways, it's kind of like the happy slave image, right? But more modern than that. Right? So this is kind of her first image that she has. And so the big things about the mammy is that she is nurturing, happy to work, and she is desexualized. You never see the portrayal of servants, right? I didn't see the movie The Help, but a lot of people criticize The Help as having characters that were essentially like mammifications. That's another term that she uses, right? So one thing that we do often treat black women as is happy and hardworking, nurturing, and desexualized. And we do that, and she talks about like, in here, like the mammification of black professional women. Right, and the black mammification is essentially sort of like rendering black women into something asexual when they're professionals, right? They get treated as, right, sort of asexual laborers. So, we'll get more into sexualization stuff later. I have a whole week on it. But like one thing to note in here is there's a lot of talk about women, black women being desexualized, right? Why is that? Do you think? In what ways can we see black women as being desexualized by our culture?
A lot of modeling jobs are given to white women.
Yeah, usually a lot of modeling jobs are given to white women. Predominantly when somebody gets treated as attractive in our culture, it's predominantly people who are of European descent, right? If black women are portrayed as attractive, they often have specifically very white features, blue eyes, their hair's straightened. First of all, there's a big thing about hair, right? Like, what is African Americans' hair like, naturally?
Coarse and curly.
Yeah, does it look like white people's hair? How many African Americans do you see, particularly African American women, who have hair that look like white people? Quite a few. How's that happen?